This short documentary series on the humanities in Europe today, which starts from Europe but will expand to cover, I hope, the whole world, is the initiative of the European network of humanities centers and institutes. We decided collectively with our colleagues that it would be a good idea to present a series of portraits of leading figures in the humanities in our part of the world, and to use them as sources of inspirations, as role models, if you wish, for practitioners and students alike. The portraits of these very sort of charismatic, highly accomplished, distinguished professionals accomplishes another aim. It allows us to trace a genealogical sort of portrait of where the humanities have been, where they are at today, and where they could go, insofar as each person that we interview is asked to trace their own itinerary, past, present, and future. And simply by asking a question like, what was your faculty called when you studied as an undergraduate? And noticing the semantic, the institutional, the political transformations that the field has gone through. Just by doing that, I think the viewers should be in a position to measure the extent of the changes and the extent of the vitality of the field. The hope of this mini-series is indeed that we can collectively, as practitioners but also as spectators, express our love for, our trust in, our respect for this amazing field of the humanities at a time in its history when it is coming under attack in the press, in the public debate, in policy making and financial decisions that are really penalizing this field. The humanities in the 21st century, as you will see in the different portraits of these great figures we're offering to you, are a vital, vibrant, critical, creative, extremely accountable field, proud of its history, confident of its place in the world, and very hopeful for the future. We really hope that you will enjoy watching these great figures, and maybe you will be yourself tempted to run out and interview somebody that you know in your own neighborhood, in your own circles, because the humanities are everywhere and for everybody.
So my earliest degrees were at the University of Cologne and the University of California, Santa Barbara. So I got an MA in English literature while I was on a fellowship with a German academic exchange service. And then I went back to the University of Cologne, where I had originally started, and finished a degree there that was a Master of Arts, Magister Artium, in what was called at the time Romanische Philologie, so Romance philology. So my main subject was French, and I had minor subjects in English and Spanish. So that was where it started out. Right now I'm employed by a Department of English with a cross appointment in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. And I consider myself now really to be a comparatist. I mean, comparative literature is really what I do on a day-to-day basis, with some more emphasis on American literature than others because I'm in a Department of English. But really most of what I teach is comparative literature. It was not always clear to me that it was going to be literary studies. In fact, when I studied at the University of Cologne, and I was in philology, what was called philology then, in the first 2 years of our study, we had to divide up our time evenly between linguistics and literary studies. And at the time, I thought that linguistics was going to be my future. And it was a series of contingencies, I have to say, that led me into literary studies in the end. Because when I went overseas, it was to study English. And English in the US means literature. It does not mean linguistics, which is a totally separate department. So at that moment, and without me being fully aware of it, my career became a little bit separated from the linguistic track. And even though I took it back up when I went back to University of Cologne for a couple of years, when the time came to reapply for PhDs in the United States, I thought I had a much better chance of being accepted by English departments than by linguistic departments, because I already had an American MA in that field and I didn't have one in linguistics. Now, I should say, retrospectively, had I had more expert advising at that moment, I would have done what I always advise my students in similar situations to do now, which is simply split your applications, apply to some universities for one field, at other universities for another, and see where you get admitted and what kinds of financial support offers you get. That was another important thing. I had no money at the time and I was going to the United States where graduate school is expensive. So unless they gave me some kind of complete fellowship, I wasn't going to be able to do it. I have always been more interested in Romance languages than in English per se, and in questions of linguistics more broadly speaking. But when I went to UC Santa Barbara, first on a one-year fellowship from the German Academic Exchange Service, and then staying on my own for another year to complete the MA degree, I was very taken in by the American academic system at the level of graduate study. I thought it was exhilarating, it was challenging. This was 1983. It was the moment when literary theory was erupting as a major new force. I had some incredible teachers at UC Santa Barbara, both in the field that I thought at the time was going to be my preferred field of study, which was Renaissance, and in narrative theory, which has remained with me as one of my main interests. And so when I came back to Germany, I liked it, but it wasn't where I saw myself going in the future. And then let's also mention that once I had decided I was embarking on an academic career, there were not very many academic jobs in the future of a graduating PhD in Germany in philology in the 1980s, and particularly at the time, not for women. They still had much fewer chances than men. And I should add that at that moment, this was about 1986, 1987, the Modern Language Association, which is the major professional organization for people in literature and linguistics in the United States, predicted a golden age for the early 90s, exactly the time when I was going to finish my PhD. And this was based on demographics. They said all the people who were hired in the major push to hire academic faculty in the late 60s and early 70s will hit retirement age in the early 90s. So those were the reasons. There was a push factor and a pull factor. The pull factor turned out not to be true, because by the time the 90s rolled around, we were in an economic recession. So many people did indeed retire, but many of these posts were not filled. And the other thing that happened was unpredictable, I think, by anybody's count, which was that the Supreme Court in the early 90s passed a sentence whereby professors could no longer be forced to retire at age 70. And enough people took that up, even only for 3 or 4 years, and stayed on past age 70, that it actually slowed down the opening up of the job market. So when I did in fact end up going on the job market in 1992, it wasn't a great job market at all. So the amazing thing was that I moved from Europe to the United States and encountered French literary theory actually going to graduate school at the University of California in the early 80s. And when I went back in 1985 and went back to actually French literature as my main subject, I pursued some of the interests that I had acquired, and I ended up writing my master's thesis on Marguerite de Navarre's Heptameron using narratological procedures on it, and it was really fascinating work at the time. And I realized that all of my professors at the University of Cologne actually knew narratology and knew other kinds of French theory perfectly, but they were not teaching it. That was the astonishing thing. They knew that theory perfectly, and they supervised my master's thesis extremely well indeed and were very helpful, but it was never mentioned in graduate seminars at the time. So there was a strange gap between what they had taken in and what they considered suitable to transmit to students. As part of an explanation, I should add that I was, of course, sitting in graduate seminars with people, most of whom were taking the teachers' exams, the Staatsexamen, because that was the main professional outcome for a degree in languages in Germany at the time, still is. So most people, I mean, either went into an academic career or you went into high school teaching. And of course, for high school teaching, the idea was that this was maybe not the most useful thing. This is conjectural. I don't know that I ever asked them directly, why aren't you teaching this? They certainly never kept me from using it in my seminar papers or from using it in my master's thesis, but it was not something I learned at the German university at the time. I think the impact of environmental studies, eco-criticism, and environmental humanities on the humanities in Germany has been a little bit different, and it depends what field you look at. Germany has a very active field of environmental history, and the environmental history work that's being done is very, very interesting indeed. I'm thinking of people like Radko and Ukrter, and so there's just work that's very interesting and that I've greatly benefited from. And there's also a considerable amount of work in environmental philosophy. In literature, the trajectory has been interesting. Eco-criticism has been introduced into Germany first the way it's been introduced almost everywhere outside of the United States, which is by way of Americanist scholars taking it up and practicing it first in American literature. So it was first in departments of English and departments of English and American literature, which are somewhat different. In Germany, they're not rolled into one the way they usually are in the United States. So you have Anglistic and you have Amerikanistic, which are at least different branches in Germany, if not different departments, which they also are in some places. So it was taken up by Americanists, first of all, and then it was applied to German literature in the first instance by Germanists working in Great Britain and in the United States. And only over the last 5 or 10 years has it been taken up by Germanists in Germany. So that's a relatively recent turn. And I'm not sure that I understand completely why that is, other than that it seems that for most of the non-American literatures, the contact with Americanists, who were the first to pioneer the field, seems in some way to have opened up the path everywhere to see how environmental philosophy and just environmental activism could be made useful for the study of literary analysis. For the United States, I think there is a particular intellectual trajectory that is interesting because eco-criticism there assumed institutional shape in the early 1990s. So it was during a convention of the Western Literature Association in 1992 that crucial figures such as Scott Slovic, Michael Branch, and Cheryl Glotfelty decided in a back room of a casino in Reno, Nevada, which is where the conference was taking place, that it was time to formalize what they had already been interested in for several years, which was taking an environmental approach to the study of literature. And they founded the Association for the Study of Literature and the Environment, which then took official shape in 1993. Looking back on that history, there were, of course, some precedents. One thinks of Raymond Williams's The Country and the City from 1973, or even earlier, Leo Marx's The Machine and the Garden from 1964 for the American analogous argument. But the question is, why did environmentalism, which is one of the new social movements of the 1960s, make its impact on literary studies so late? All the other social movements of the 1960s, whether it's feminism, the civil rights movement, the interest in decolonization, all of them had made their mark on literary studies decades before environmentalism. And I think that's not an easy question to answer, but in that case, my closest estimate of what caused this would be that during the 70s and 80s, literary studies were mostly inflected by post-structuralist theory. And post-structuralist theory certainly had a sort of anti-realist, had this constructivist strain that at the time seemed hard for people to reconcile with an interest in nature and its crises out in the real world. So some of the most productive and interesting work in post-structuralist studies, like Roland Barthes's work, on anthropology and on nature. Some of the work that emerged in cultural studies, both following on Foucault and on other forms of post-structuralism in the late 80s and early 90s, saw nature mainly as something that needed to be questioned. Whenever you see the term nature or biology, ask what power interest is being cloaked, is being hidden behind those claims. That was basically the philosophy that I grew up with as a graduate student in the late 1980s. So that did not make it easy to think about the actual state of the actual natural world in the way that environmentalists were talking about it, toxification, beginning of concern about biodiversity loss, and so on. I mean, those were not things that you could very easily talk about if your assumption was that anytime nature was mentioned, it was actually the power claims of a particular social group that were being talked about. So when eco-criticism emerged in the 1990s, it was actually at first with a fairly pronounced reaction against post-structuralist theory, often understood in a relatively reductivist way, and also a reaction against theory more broadly speaking. So when I came into the field circa 1998, I at first actually felt a little uncomfortable with it because I was very interested in the issues, but then very uncomfortable with the anti-theoretical rhetoric, very uncomfortable with the way in which everything that I had been taught to consider essentialist, sort of the connection to the local, and those kinds of things were actually being considered foundations at the time. So it was very confusing, and it took me a while to find ways of bringing together my theoretical interests and my comparatist interests with eco-criticism. I was teaching at Columbia University at the time, so it was a very theoretical place. It was Edward Said was teaching there, Gayatri Spivak was teaching there, Bruce Robbins came in while I was teaching there. So these are all people very invested in theory, and so whenever I went to the eco-critical conferences, it was a different world, and I was sort of going back and forth between those two different worlds, which in ways that felt quite uncomfortable. But in 1998, at the conference, the annual conference at the time, the Diversity Caucus was founded as a first reaction against the prevailing interest in just literature by white authors being analyzed by mostly white critics. And that was a first step. And then after the millennium, there was just a huge influx of young scholars into the field that had been trained in all kinds of different theoretical orientations. There were a lot of people interested in post-colonial criticism, some people interested in post-structuralism, and then strains that had been there all along, but that had not been dominant. For example, the interest in ecofeminism. Just became more visible, became more dominant. Ecofeminism had been there all along, and then, very quickly also mutated into queer studies and so on. So it changed very quickly, and the most fertile area in the mid-2000s proved to be post-colonial eco-criticism. So the work of people like Susie O'Brien, Rob Nixon, Elizabeth DeLugri, George Handley, Graham Huggan, Helen Tiffin, and others then really turned around the field because they opened up the whole canon of Anglophone literatures and a whole body of theory and a whole body of thinking about the connections between colonialism, the oppression of humans, and the degradation of nature that hadn't been done before. And so that really energized the field and opened up all kinds of new directions. And then very quickly other things came in. I mean, there were cross-fertilizations with the emergent area of critical animal studies. So thinking about the human subject in a sort of post-structuralist vein, but in connection with the problematic of the animal. Food studies has come in over the last 5 to 6 years, again on a comparative basis, but thinking about food as actually having to do with systems of production and distribution and consumption, so having to do with economic systems, having to do, of course, in a major way with culture, having to do with language, having to do with perceptions of animals and other species. I mean, which species do you eat? Which ones do you not eat? Which ones do you keep as pets? How do these categories exclude each other? So all of these came in as new areas, and some of them were areas new to eco-criticism, but old to other areas of literary study. And then some of these areas like food studies, critical animal studies were new across literary and cultural studies, more broadly speaking. So it really changed, and as a consequence, I think over the last 15 years, eco-criticism is almost unrecognizable, I would say, now in terms of both the historical depth of study, that we go back all the way to the Middle Ages now, and there's really interesting work on how medieval cultures perceived the natural world and what worries about risks to humans and risks to non-humans that were actually present in medieval literature, all the way to postmodernism, and now there's a huge array of different genres. So we're not just looking at nonfiction writing and novels and poetry, but also documentary film and travel writing and popular science and photography, enormously important genre for eco-criticism. So it's really become a super lively field that it's in fact hard to keep up with. So I'm based in the Department of English at UCLA with a cross appointment in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And so some of my duties are the usual ones of, a university professor, so research, teaching, and a not inconsiderable amount of administration all form part of the portfolio. As an environmental scholar, I think one always has one eye out on activism and policy in various guises. There's not always time to pursue that in the way that a full-time activist can, but certainly that is something that is always present, and in a place like Los Angeles cannot but be present. I mean, we're going through a major drought, which some people refer to as a 4-year drought. It's actually more like a 15-year drought with a few intermissions. And so that conditions a lot of the way in which nature is talked about in California in general, in terms of who consumes the most water. Is it cities or is it agriculture? Where should the greatest cuts be undertaken? Who will most be hurt by regulations of water consumption? And then the question of what this drought is due to. Is this simply a pattern that in a Mediterranean climate like California has actually prevailed for centuries, which factually speaking is true. California had 100-year droughts as far back as the Middle Ages. But in the Middle Ages, there weren't 40 million people living there, drawing down the aquifer and doing large-scale agriculture. So these days, and we didn't have any cities of 10 million people or anything like that. So it's a very different problem now, and the question of how drought combines with depletion of aquifers and also possibly with climate change is a very acute question. Then another question that I'm very interested in Los Angeles is the current rethinking of environmentalism and ecology from focusing on mostly wild and rural areas to the city. And we're thinking about a really interesting project currently about trying to analyze biodiversity in Los Angeles, in the metropolitan area, both from a biological viewpoint, just figuring out what species are here, which we don't really know, and it's not known for a lot of major cities around the world, because cities just have not been a focus for biological and biodiversity research. There are some good studies of birds, and for different cities, different kinds of surveys have been done of plants and of insects and so forth, but we don't really yet understand how cities work as novel ecosystems of a sort. And for me as a cultural scholar, the huge interest of this would be to combine it with empirical cultural work to see how different cultural communities in the city relate to these species, which ones they know about, which ones they don't know, which ones they want around, which ones they'd rather not see, which ones they don't care about one way or another. What kinds of cultural practices are associated with certain plants and animals and microorganisms? What kinds of stories are told about them? So these are all fascinating subjects of study for a metropolitan area where at least 26 languages are being spoken. So there's an important cultural dimension to this that I think has never been done in conjunction with the biological analysis, and so we're very excited about that project. So I just finished writing a book that's called Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, which is not about mass extinction of species being imaginary, but about what cultural resonances it has and why and how it matters to different cultural communities. And one of the really interesting things that I ran into in doing the research, both on the science that informs statements about current biodiversity loss and the cultural products that come out of it, which are incredible in number and quality. I mean, there's since the 1980s, dozens of books and films, hundreds of documentary films in particular, and thousands of photographs and websites, even some video games, some musical compositions about these problems. So one thing that emerged both in the science and in these cultural representations of it is the question of how we relate to other species, what that species concept even means to different cultural communities, and what species we value, and which ones we don't value. And one thing that there's two things about that I'm very interested in. One is the question of how cultural diversity interacts with biological diversity in the urban context. The other part is more general, and it's the question of whether there is such a thing as cultural species. In other words, the taxonomies of biology are really interesting, but they're often not the taxonomies that ordinary people have in their heads. I mean, one of my brothers once said, all I know how to distinguish is daisies and non-daisies among the flowering plants. And there's a lot of people who'll tell you, well, I can tell a pigeon from a non-pigeon, but that's about it. So a lot of people have limited ability to recognize certain species in certain taxa, but we'll have a very detailed understanding of, say, different vine grapes if they're wine connoisseurs, right? Even if they know nothing about pigeons. So the question of which species matter culturally as in comparison with what gets distinguished biologically, scientifically, is one that I find really interesting. And so I would be really interested in doing a project about how cultural taxonomies of plants and animals line up with scientific taxonomies. So it could build on work in ethnobotany, but I'm also always interested as a scholar of literature in the stories that get told, not just in the taxonomies, but what got us the taxonomies where they are, and how these cultural taxonomies interact or clash with the scientific taxonomies to produce current biological and ecological crises, and how they might actually be mobilized to solve them. If I could name that field, it might be something like multispecies theory or multispecies studies. There's an interesting area in anthropology that has been formulated over the last 5 or so years called multispecies ethnography, which aims to redescribe human communities in terms of its interrelations with animal communities and plant communities, and actually to show how what we usually understand as human societies or human communities are in fact made up out of intricate interactions between microorganisms, plants, animals, and humans, all the way from the microbes that inhabit our guts to the wheat that we ingest to the poodles that we keep in our living rooms. So there's a wide array of different species interactions that field focuses on, and that it analyzes both with a view to being descriptive and also to some extent in terms of establishing ethical norms for what are the best ways of interacting with these other species. So my work in some ways builds on that, but gives it in some sense a more narrative twist, and is also deeply interested in different discourses about what structures these interrelations. So I'm at heart a comparatist in that respect. I'm always interested in how do different cultural communities, which sometimes can be countries but not invariably, sometimes they're supranational entities like Europe versus North America, sometimes they're different cultures within what is nominally one country. How do they do things differently? How do they see things differently? How do they label things differently? And there's precedence, obviously, in older kinds of anthropology as well. Ethnobotany and ethnozoology have long looked at different taxonomies, but I think recent developments in animal studies and post-human philosophy and in anthropology itself can give this work, I think, a whole new twist. So I started out my career as a specialist in postmodern literature. So I was hired a couple of times as the specialist on contemporary American and European literature, and to some extent Latin American literature. And I was very interested in sort of the experimental forms of art and literature that derived from the European and Latin American avant-gardes of the early 20th century. And I found myself in the first few years of my career teaching surveys of 20th century literature, both the entire 20th century, sometimes high modernist literature, sometimes postmodernist literature. And during that time, I developed an interest in birds, and I remember going to Hawaii in 1993 after I had finished my PhD, sort of as a reward to myself, and being fascinated by the parrots that were being sold in the streets of Maui. But at the time thinking it was a really bad idea. I was moving from California to New York, so it was not a great moment to acquire a pet. But a few years later, in 1995, I encountered the avian love of my life, a young Jardines parrot named Michiko in a pet store in Wellesley in Massachusetts, where I was visiting a friend. And I brought her home, and within a few months was absolutely stunned at the intelligence of this bird, whom I named Michiko. Beautiful green bird with feathers on her back, black and scalloped in green. So she was a beautiful little bird to look at, but also incredibly lively and incredibly smart. And she managed at the time not just to manipulate me into pretty much anything she wanted done, but also, the thing that amazed me more, to manipulate my then boyfriend into doing what she wanted, often more effectively than I could. And this was a turning point for both of us, since neither of us had thought in depth about animals. We were superficially interested in them, but it was not a passion. But being confronted with the intelligence and the social skill of a very young, relatively inexperienced bird who got better at it as she got older, really was a turning point, because I started looking around outside my apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and just seeing pigeons flying around and wondering, well, I never pay attention to these pigeons normally, but are they actually as smart as this parrot? Turns out they probably are not. Psittacines and corvids are notoriously smarter than other kinds of birds, but actually pigeons are. They do engage in complex social life and are probably much smarter than most of us give them credit for. And there have been actually some studies that they know how to distinguish numbers and colors in complex ways that we hadn't anticipated. So I got interested in birds. I started bird watching, and in New York, Central Park actually turns out to be an excellent place for bird watching for about 8 weeks in the spring and 6 weeks in the fall, when practically all of the East Coast migrating birds come through, and they fly over this ocean of steel and glass that is greater New York, and parks like Central Park stick out to them like a sore thumb, and that's where they all land. And it's a wonderful place to watch and identify birds. And so then through this phenomenon of migration, I also started to become interested in the ecological connections. So these are birds that I could only watch during certain times in New York. Then there were other birds that were there year-round, but that was a much smaller number. And so I became interested in which birds you saw in which years and why, and what were the challenges. Among other things, in the city itself, tens of thousands of migrating songbirds get killed every year in cities like Toronto and New York because they were flying into skyscrapers, whose glass windows they cannot distinguish from the surrounding landscape. And bird watchers have now worked extensively with corporations that own these buildings to put films on them that the birds can see so that they don't get killed in such great numbers. But then there's all kinds of challenges also in the endpoints of migration. And so slowly this ended up creating my interest in the environment. But I've always been interested in two things in particular about environmentalism. One is in my book that came out in 2008, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet. One was a certain skepticism vis-a-vis the types of environmentalism that base environmental ethics on a closely felt connection to the local. Not that I didn't think that was not important. It can clearly be an avenue for some people, but that hadn't been my own experience. So I started thinking the attachment to the local is not the be-all and end-all of environmentalism. There are other modes of getting at an environmentalist perception of the world and to environmental advocacy. And I was interested in exploring those and in exploring how we get from the local to the global. And those have always been present in environmentalist discourse, but in very different ways. And how do we think about really relating to the global as citizens and with a cultural understanding of one or two or three other places in the world where the environment itself and other species might be looked at quite differently. So that comparatist perspective was always something that interested me a great deal about environmentalism. Even as we're dealing with phenomena in the natural world, how do these phenomena actually present themselves differently in different languages? I mean, to begin with, a sense of place. How do you say that in German? How do you say it in Spanish? It gets really interesting right there because there isn't sort of a one-on-one translation. In German you would say Heimat probably, which is a word that has very complex connections. In Spanish you would probably say localismo, except in Spain actually a lot of localism comes touted as nationalism, meaning Catalan or Galician nationalism, nacionalismo, which doesn't mean an attachment to Spain, but an attachment to Galicia or to Catalunya, which again is then very different and makes the whole problem appear in a very different light. So that's been one thing that interests me in particular about environmentalism, and the other one has always been an interest about the way in which environmentalism is about our relation to other species. And so I'm almost tempted to rename it multi-species thinking or multi-species studies or multi-species theory now, because I think fundamentally it is about that. Environmentalism is not only about that, but if we were to think about environmentalism as a commitment to multi-species justice, I think it would actually allow us to talk to people who may not be environmentalists at all and may not be caught dead in hiking boots ever, and may not go out and enjoy landscapes, but who have very deeply felt and deeply lived attachments to the animals in their lives, whether it's cats or dogs or something else, or the fish in their aquarium. And so there's one bridge there, then there's a whole other connection to people who are deeply interested in food. Or I lived in the Castro district of San Francisco for 7 years. And there were a lot of gay men there predominantly who actually weren't primarily interested in the environment, but if you got them started talking about health and about environmental impacts on health, they were actually suddenly very eloquent and very interested. So it seems to me that different communities construct different relationships to species, and that's something that I'm very passionate about exploring.